January 17, 1944. South China Sea. 0347 hours. The water is black. Not the blue black of a tropical night, but the oil-stained, predatory black that swallows light and exhales silence. Beneath the surface, 300 feet down, USS Flasher hangs suspended in a liquid void. Inside her pressure hull, 68 men breathe in shifts, slow, deliberate, conserving oxygen like miners trapped underground. The air tastes metallic. Sweat and diesel fuel and fear have a specific chemistry, and every man aboard knows its formula by heart. Lieutenant Commander Reuben Whitaker stands motionless in the conning tower, one hand resting on the periscope housing. He does not move, has not moved for 40 minutes. Around him, the control room crew operates in near silence. Hand signals, whispered coordinates, the soft click of valves being adjusted with surgical precision. Above them, somewhere in the darkness of the surface world, Japanese destroyers circle like wolves who have caught a scent. Then it comes. The first depth charge detonates 200 yards to starboard. The ocean itself seems to convulse. Flasher lurches sideways, her hull groaning with a sound that is almost human, a deep, protesting shriek of riveted steel compressed beyond tolerance. Light bulbs shatter, a gauge explodes in a spray of glass. In the after-torpedo room, a seaman grips a stanchion so hard his knuckles turn white as bone. And he thinks about his mother's kitchen in Ohio, the yellow curtains, the smell of bread baking on Saturday mornings. He thinks about anything except the pressure wave that just tried to crush his skull. Whitaker's hand does not leave the periscope housing. His voice, when it comes, is barely a whisper. Steady, hold trim. The second charge is closer. This is not how the Imperial Japanese Navy expected the war to proceed. Not in January of 1944, 37 months after Pearl Harbor, when the Pacific should have been theirs by divine mandate and superior spirit. The strategy had been elegant in its brutality. Cripple the American fleet, seize the resources of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter so vast that the soft, democracy-weakened Americans would negotiate peace rather than pay the blood price of reconquest. It was a strategy built on cultural assumption that a nation of individualists, of comfort seekers and pleasure lovers, could not sustain the collective sacrifice required for total war. The assumption was wrong, catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. But in January of 1944, the Japanese Naval Command still did not fully comprehend the nature of their miscalculation. They saw the statistics, the American submarines that prowled the convoy routes with increasing boldness, the merchant tonnage disappearing into the deep, the supply lines to their garrisons stretching thinner with each passing month. They saw these things, but they interpreted them through the lens of Bushido, of warrior spirit, of the conviction that superior morale must eventually triumph over superior materiel. They had not yet understood what Commander Whitaker and his crew represented. Not warriors in the traditional sense, but technicians of violence, practitioners of industrialized lethality backed by a nation that could produce submarines faster than Japan could sink them, torpedoes faster than they could be fired, and replacement crews faster than they could be killed. The Americans brought to undersea warfare the same principle they brought to every aspect of the conflict. Abundance as strategy, logistics as philosophy, the patient, inexorable application of resources so vast they bordered on the obscene. The third depth charge explodes directly overhead. Flasher drops like a stone, her bow tilting down at an angle that sends unsecured equipment sliding forward with a clatter that sounds like bones breaking. In the maneuvering room, electricians fight to maintain depth control as the submarine plunges through her test depth, past the point where the hull should rupture, into pressure realms where steel becomes as flexible as skin. The fourth charge follows, then the fifth, then the sixth. Whitaker counts them silently. Each detonation is a diagnostic tool, revealing the enemy's pattern, their search geometry, the declining accuracy that indicates they are guessing now, firing blind into an ocean that refuses to give up its secrets. After the 9th explosion, he allows himself the smallest adjustment of posture, a slight relaxation of his shoulders that his executive officer recognizes as the submarine equivalent of a smile. "They've lost us," Whitaker says quietly. But he does not order the boat to periscope depth, not yet, because the Japanese destroyer crews above are experiencing something that undermines the very foundation of their training: doubt. They have followed the doctrine precisely, executed the depth charge pattern with textbook accuracy, dropped enough explosives to shatter a city block, and the American submarine has simply vanished. Not destroyed, not surfaced in distress, vanished. For men trained to believe in the supremacy of fighting spirit over material conditions, this is existentially troubling. The depth charges are not merely weapons, they are expressions of will, of the certainty that Japanese determination must eventually force the enemy to yield. When the ocean swallows those expressions without response, when the Americans refuse even the courtesy of dying visibly, it introduces a hairline fracture in the architecture of belief. The 10th, 11th, and 12th charges come in rapid succession, poorly aimed, increasingly desperate. The destroyer captains are firing now not with tactical precision, but with something closer to rage. The rage of hunters who have wounded prey and watched it escape into brush too thick to follow. Flasher absorbs each blast with the stoic endurance of welded steel and disciplined silence. Her crew having long ago learned the submarine's fundamental lesson: patience is survival, and survival is victory. Hours pass. The ocean returns to its normal texture of silence. At 071 hours, Whitaker orders the boat to periscope depth, and the lens breaks the surface into a dawn of extraordinary beauty, gold light spilling across water that shows no evidence of the violence conducted in its depths. The Japanese destroyers are gone, steaming east toward convoy duty, their crews filing reports that will describe probable kill, enemy submarine destroyed, mission accomplished. The reports are filed because the alternative, that they dropped 18 depth charges on a target that simply absorbed the punishment and waited them out, is unthinkable. But Flasher is not merely intact, she is hunting. In the forward torpedo room, torpedo men reload tubes with the casual efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. Each Mark 14 torpedo weighs 3,280 pounds and contains 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, a blend so powerful it makes traditional TNT seem quaint. The weapons are temperamental, prone to running deep or failing to detonate, products of a peacetime procurement system that prioritized cost over reliability. But by January 1944, the worst defects have been corrected through the brutal empiricism of combat, and the Mark 14 has become what it was always meant to be: a ship killer of singular lethality. The torpedoes represent something the Japanese planners never adequately factored into their strategic calculations: American industrial capacity, not just for production but for iteration. Where the Japanese Navy entered the war with superior torpedoes and assumed that superiority would remain constant, the Americans entered with inferior weapons and then systematically, almost obsessively, fixed them. Each malfunction was documented, analyzed, corrected. Each failure became data. Each loss became institutional memory that prevented the next loss. This was not warrior spirit. This was engineering culture applied to mass death, and it was devastatingly effective. Whitaker studies the charts spread across the wardroom table. Intelligence reports indicate a major convoy forming at Cam Ranh Bay, troop transports and cargo vessels preparing to resupply the garrisons in the Philippines. The convoy route is predictable because it must be predictable. There are only so many channels deep enough for large vessels, only so many approaches that allow mutual air cover. The Japanese face an impossible geometry. Their empire is vast, their supply lines extended, and every critical route is a choke point waiting for submarines like Flasher to exploit. "We'll intercept here," Whitaker says, tapping a position 30 miles southeast of Cape Petaharan. "Night surface attack, 4-fish spread." His executive officer nods. "They have done this before. We'll do it again." The routine of it is almost industrial. Locate convoy, achieve firing position, launch torpedoes, submerge, evade counterattack, reload, repeat. There is nothing glorious about it in the traditional sense. No banzai charges, no last stands, no samurai theater. Just mathematics and patience and the cold application of explosive force against steel hulls.
Filled with men who did not choose their deaths but will receive them anyway. The Japanese soldiers and sailors aboard those transports have their own expectations, shaped by propaganda that promises certain victory and emphasizes spiritual superiority over material advantage. They have been told that American submarines are operated by cowards who fight without honor, who strike from concealment and flee from confrontation. This narrative serves a purpose. It explains defeats without admitting to fundamental strategic miscalculation. If the enemy is dishonorable rather than effective, then Japanese losses become proof of virtue rather than evidence of failure. But the men on the transports, the ones who have already survived months or years in the Pacific theater, know better. They have seen the cargo ships explode and sink, have watched supply convoys get smaller and less frequent, have eaten diminishing rations and worn threadbare uniforms while being told that Japan's industrial might is inexhaustible. The disconnect between doctrine and reality has become too wide to ignore, and in the quiet spaces between official pronouncements, soldiers whisper the truth to each other. The Americans are winning because they have more of everything, and no amount of fighting spirit can compensate for material disparity at this scale. January 19, 1944, 2100 hours. Flasher lies on the surface, her diesel engines rumbling as she charges batteries and makes transit speed toward the intercept point. The night is moonless, visibility less than 1,000 yards. Perfect conditions. Whitaker stands on the bridge, binoculars scanning the horizon, and thinks about the peculiar loneliness of submarine command. He is responsible for 68 lives, for a multi-million-dollar weapon system, for the execution of strategic policy through tactical action. But mostly, he is responsible for making decisions in the absence of complete information and then living with the consequences. At 22:47 hours, the radar operator reports multiple contacts bearing 090, range 15,000 yards. The convoy. "Clear the bridge. Dive, dive." Flasher slides beneath the surface with practiced efficiency, leveling off at periscope depth. Through the lens, Whitaker sees them, shadows against shadows, the dark silhouettes of cargo vessels in column formation, flanked by destroyer escorts whose wakes are visible as phosphorescent trails. He counts 6 transports, probably 7,000 tons each, loaded with troops or supplies or both. 42,000 tons of shipping, thousands of men. The arithmetic of naval warfare reduces human complexity to displacement and target angle. "Solution ready," the torpedo data computer operator reports. Whitaker makes minute adjustments to the periscope bearing. The leading transport is broadside at 1,200 yards, a target so ideal it seems almost generous. He knows what will happen in the next 3 minutes, has watched it happen before. The torpedoes will cross the dark water at 46 knots, their contra-rotating propellers leaving minimal wake. Their contact exploders primed to detonate against hulls designed for cargo capacity, not damage resistance. The explosions will rip open compartments below the waterline, flooding troop berthing spaces and holds, dragging ships down by the bow or stern, depending on where the impacts concentrate. Men will be killed instantly by the blasts, or slowly by drowning, or catastrophically by boiler explosions when seawater hits superheated steel. Fire 1. The submarine shudders slightly as compressed air launches the first torpedo. 4 seconds later, fire 2, then 3, then 4. The weapons run hot, straight, and normal, a phrase that encompasses nightmarish violence wrapped in procedural language. 120 seconds. That is how long it takes for physics and engineering to convert potential energy into devastation. Whitaker counts the interval in his head, a habit from dozens of previous attacks. At 118 seconds, the first torpedo strikes the leading transport amidships. The explosion is visible even through the periscope, a sudden bloom of yellow fire that silhouettes the vessel's superstructure before the flame is replaced by a column of water and debris reaching 200 feet into the night sky. The second torpedo hits the same ship near the bow. The third and fourth strike the vessel behind it. Within 90 seconds, 2 transports are sinking, their hulls torn open, their compartments flooding faster than damage control parties can respond. On the decks, men scramble for lifeboats that
were never intended to handle full evacuation. Some jump into water that is dark and warm and infinitely deep. Others are trapped below, in spaces where the water rises with relentless patience, where the darkness is absolute, and where death arrives as pressure and liquid and the end of oxygen. Take her deep, right full rudder, ahead full. Flasher dives and turns, accelerating away from the attack point, putting distance between herself and the inevitable counterattack. Behind her, the convoy dissolves into chaos. The destroyer escorts light their searchlights, sweeping the ocean for targets they will not find. They drop depth charges on sonar contacts that turn out to be false returns, thermoclines and schools of fish, and the acoustic ghosts of their own machinery. The explosions are visible from Flasher's position as distant flashes, irrelevant thunder that disturbs only water and fish. Commander Whitaker orders the boat rigged for silent running and allows himself a moment of professional satisfaction. 2 confirmed sinks, 14,000 tons, mission success by any metric. But he is already thinking about the next attack, the next intercept point, the next convoy that will expose itself to the patient violence of American submarines. The Japanese destroyer crews, meanwhile, are experiencing something worse than military defeat. They are experiencing inefficacy. They have the will to fight. They have the training and the doctrine and the spiritual conviction. What they lack is the ability to locate and destroy an enemy who operates in a medium where their advantages evaporate. The ocean refuses to respect their determination. The submarines refuse to surface and accept honorable combat. And the convoys continue to sink with a regularity that begins to feel less like warfare and more like industrial process. Inputs and outputs, tonnage delivered and tonnage destroyed. A ledger maintained somewhere in Washington or Pearl Harbor, where Japanese lives and material are reduced to statistics in a campaign of methodical economic strangulation. 24 hours later, Flasher strikes again. This time the target is a 4-ship convoy heading south from Saigon. Cargo vessels carrying rubber and tin and other resources extracted from occupied territories. The raw materials meant to feed Japan's war machine. The attack occurs in daylight, from submerged position, with periscope observations taken in brief glimpses that expose the instrument for mere seconds before lowering it back into concealment. Whitaker fires a 3-torpedo spread at the lead freighter and is rewarded with 2 solid hits that break the ship's back, literally. The vessel hinges in the middle and begins to fold in on itself, its cargo spilling into water that foams with escaping air and petroleum. The escorts respond with depth charge attacks that are accurate enough to rattle Flasher's crew but not precise enough to cause serious damage. The Japanese destroyer captains are brave. They are skilled. They execute their doctrine with precision. But they are hunting an opponent who has mastered the art of patience, who can lie silent at test depth for hours, who can absorb punishment that would destroy lesser boats and crews, and who represents not individual heroism but systematic technological advantage applied with industrial consistency. January 21, 1944. Dawn. Flasher surfaces into a morning of unsettling calm. The sea is glass smooth, the sky empty of clouds or aircraft. Whitaker orders battery charge and allows the crew to rotate through the conning tower in small groups, letting them breathe air that does not taste of machine oil and desperation. The men emerge pale and blinking, their skin waxy from weeks submerged, their expressions carrying the peculiar dissociation of submariners who have spent too long in an environment where day and night are abstractions and survival depends on absolute silence. In the wardroom, Whitaker reviews the patrol report. 6 confirmed sinkings in 3 days. 37,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. 0 casualties aboard Flasher. The numbers would be impressive if they were not becoming routine. Across the Pacific, American submarines are conducting similar operations with similar results. A distributed campaign of attrition that is slowly, inexorably severing Japan's maritime lifelines. No single attack is decisive. No individual patrol will end the war. But cumulatively, relentlessly, the submarines are accomplishing what battleships and carriers cannot. They are making Japan's empire much smaller.
Economically unsustainable. The Japanese military leadership, even in early 1944, does not yet fully grasp the implications. They see individual losses and attribute them to tactical failures or insufficient vigilance. They do not see the systemic collapse emerging from the accumulation of those losses. The garrisons that will starve, the factories that will halt for lack of raw materials, the civilians who will go hungry because cargo ships full of rice are resting on the ocean floor. The submarines are not merely sinking ships. They are amputating the arteries of empire, and the patient is bleeding out without quite realizing that the wounds are mortal. For the men aboard Flasher, the strategic implications are abstract. What is concrete is the routine, the endless cycle of hunting and hiding, the claustrophobia of the hull, the particular terror of depth charge attacks, the boredom punctuated by moments of extreme violence. They eat canned food and breathe recycled air, and sleep in hot bunking rotations where the sheets are always damp with someone else's sweat. They develop the submarine pallor and the submarine stare, that 1,000-yard gaze that comes from spending weeks in an environment where the horizon is a pressure hull 18 inches away. But they also experience something the Japanese propaganda narrative cannot accommodate. They experience abundance even in deprivation. The food aboard Flasher is canned and monotonous, but it is plentiful. The crew does not go hungry. The torpedoes are sophisticated and expensive, but there are always more. The submarine leaves port with 24 and will expend them with confidence that resupply is certain. When equipment breaks, replacement parts are available. When men are wounded or sick, there are medical supplies. The submarine itself, despite its discomforts, is a marvel of engineering reliability. Not perfect, but robust. Designed with redundancy and fail-safes that reflect a manufacturing philosophy where quality control is systemic rather than aspirational. This is the symbolic weight of American material. Not that it is better than Japanese equipment on a one-to-one basis, though often it is, but that there is always more of it. The abundance is psychological as much as quality. Physical. It communicates a message that penetrates deeper than propaganda, that the nation producing these weapons can afford to be profligate with resources, that the industrial base supporting the war effort is so vast that individual losses are acceptable, even expected, because they will be replaced with interest. The torpedo becomes the physical embodiment of this philosophy. Each Mark 14 costs approximately $10,000 in 1944 dollars, a sum that represents 6 months of an average American worker's salary, poured into a single-use weapon that will exist for perhaps 90 seconds after leaving the tube before either exploding or sinking irretrievably into the abyss. The economics are absurd unless you possess an economy capable of treating such expenditure as routine. Japan cannot match this, cannot even approach it. And somewhere in the calculations of their naval staff, in the quiet hours when institutional honesty is possible, they are beginning to understand that the war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factory, not by superior courage, but by superior production. January 22, 1944. Final attack.
Flasher intercepts a two-ship convoy near the Spratly Islands, oilers returning empty to Borneo to collect fuel. The symbolism is almost too perfect. Vessels designed to carry the literal energy of warfare now running on ballast, exposing themselves to destruction in the desperate attempt to maintain supply lines that are already failing. Whitaker fires 4 torpedoes and achieves 3 hits. The lead oiler explodes with sufficient force to suggest its tanks were not entirely empty. Volatile fumes ignited by the torpedo's warhead, creating a secondary explosion that lifts the ship's bow completely out of the water before it settles back and begins the terminal slide beneath the surface. The second oiler attempts to flee at maximum speed, its crew flooding ballast tanks to reduce draft, its radio operator sending desperate messages that will be intercepted by Flasher's radio man and decoded and filed as intelligence for future operations. The ship makes 8 knots before a single torpedo strikes its engine room, stopping the vessel dead. It takes 17 minutes to sink, a slow, tilting descent that gives the crew time to abandon ship, to climb into lifeboats and watch their workplace, their duty station, their home, disappear into water that accepts all offerings with equal indifference. Flasher does not surface to take prisoners. This is not cruelty, but doctrine. Submarines cannot accommodate additional personnel, cannot spare the resources, cannot risk exposure. The survivors will drift until rescue arrives or does not arrive, their fate determined by currents and chance, and the extent to which their navy can afford to divert assets to search operations in waters controlled by enemy submarines. It is the mathematics of total war, where humane impulses are subordinated to operational necessity, and no one involved can claim moral comfort. By evening, Flasher is heading east toward Pearl Harbor, her torpedo tubes empty, her fuel tanks depleted, her crew exhausted and satisfied, and ready for the temporary respite that awaits at patrol's end. Behind her, 6 ships rest on the ocean floor, graves for hundreds of men, monuments to the effectiveness of submarine warfare, data points in the larger strategic equation that will eventually render Japan's continued resistance unsustainable. Commander Whitaker stands on the bridge in the tropical darkness, smoking a cigarette and watching the stars appear. He does not think of himself as a warrior in the traditional sense. He is a technician, a manager of violence, a practitioner of applied lethality. But he understands what he represents. Not American courage or superior morale, but American capacity. The ability to project force through technology and logistics, to sustain operations through abundance, to absorb losses and continue functioning because the industrial base supporting him is effectively inexhaustible. The Japanese destroyer crews who hunted Flasher with 18 depth charges expected to destroy her because they expected that sufficient application of will and explosive force must eventually overcome material defenses. They were operating on the assumptions of a warrior culture that privileges spirit over circumstance, that believes in the transformative power of determination. They did not account for a submarine designed and built by a culture that privileges engineering over ideology, that believes in the transformative power of reliability and redundancy, and having more of everything than the enemy can possibly match. This is the ideological chasm at the heart of the Pacific War. Not democracy versus fascism in the abstract, but abundance versus scarcity as operating principles. The United States entered the conflict with an economy that could produce submarines faster than Germany and Japan combined, could manufacture torpedoes by the tens of thousands, could train replacement crews in weeks rather than years. This was not moral superiority. It was geometric advantage, the exponential difference between industrial systems operating at different scales of capacity. And the men aboard those submarines, the ones who survived 18 depth charges and sank 6 ships in 3 days, they carried with them the unconscious confidence of abundance. They knew, without needing to articulate it, that if Flasher were sunk, there would be another boat to replace her, that if they died, there would be other crews, that the campaign would continue regardless of individual fate because the system was larger than any single participant.
This knowledge was not comforting exactly, but it was clarifying. It removed the burden of existential significance from each action and allowed submariners to focus on the technical and tactical, to treat warfare as a profession rather than a spiritual crisis. The Japanese soldiers on the transports, by contrast, were increasingly aware that their deaths mattered in ways that compounded strategic failure. Each sinking reduced available shipping. Each loss of trained personnel weakened unit effectiveness. Each convoy destroyed meant garrisons went unsupplied. Battles were lost. Territories became indefensible. They were fighting not just for ideology, but against the basic arithmetic of logistics, and the arithmetic was unforgiving. In the final accounting, Flasher's 3-day rampage sank 6 ships totaling 37,000 tons, a loss that Japan could not afford and could not prevent from repeating. The submarine herself survived with minor damage, her crew largely unaware of how close some of those depth charges had come, how narrowly they had avoided the catastrophic failure that would have sent them to join the ships they destroyed. Whitaker would be awarded the Navy Cross. The crew would receive letters of commendation. The submarine would be refitted and resupplied and sent back to the war in March of 1944, where she would sink more ships and survive more depth charges and continue the patient work of amputation that eventually rendered Japan incapable of sustaining empire. The deeper truth, the one that echoes beyond the specific actions of one submarine in one patrol, is that Flasher represented a kind of warfare that Japan was ideologically unprepared to counter. Not because Japanese warriors lacked courage or skill, but because they inhabited a worldview where material conditions were supposed to be subordinate to spiritual will. The American submarine campaign demonstrated, with brutal empiricism, that this worldview was false, that superior logistics defeats superior morale, that abundance is its own form of strategy, and that wars between industrial nations are ultimately won by the side that can produce and sustain force more efficiently than the enemy can destroy or replace it. The 18 depth charges that failed to sink Flasher were not merely unsuccessful attacks, they were refutations of a philosophy. They were evidence that determination alone cannot overcome the patient application of engineering competence backed by limitless resources. The Japanese destroyer crews executed their doctrine perfectly, and it was the doctrine itself that proved insufficient, not because it was poorly conceived within its own framework, but because it was conceived within a framework that misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. And so the war continued, submarines hunting convoys, convoys attempting supply runs, destroyers dropping depth charges on targets that vanished and reappeared with frustrating regularity. The cycle repeated with variations across thousands of engagements, each one a small transaction in a larger economic campaign that was starving an empire to death. By war's end, American submarines would sink 1,314 Japanese ships, totaling 5.3 million tons, more than half of Japan's total merchant losses, achieved by a force that never numbered more than 100 boats operating simultaneously. Commander Whitaker and the crew of Flasher were not exceptional in their achievements, they were representative. And that was perhaps the most devastating fact of all, that what they accomplished, surviving 18 depth charges, sinking 6 ships in 3 days, was not an outlier, but an expectation, not a miracle, but a metric, not heroism, but process. They were the routine output of a system designed to produce exactly this result over and over, until the enemy could no longer sustain the losses. The torpedo, that symbol of American industrial philosophy, carried within its steel casing more than explosive compound. It carried a message about the nature of power in the 20th century, that abundance multiplied by efficiency equals a force that no amount of courage or spiritual conviction can withstand indefinitely. That the nation capable of producing such weapons by the tens of thousands, of training crews by the hundreds, of sustaining operations across an ocean that spans half the world, possesses an advantage so fundamental that it transcends individual battles and reshapes the strategic geometry of the entire conflict. This was the lesson the Japanese Navy learned too late,
that fighting spirit without industrial capacity is tragedy, that warriors without supply lines are ghosts, and that empires built on conquest must eventually collapse when confronted by opponents who treat warfare not as ritual, but as industrial process. Flasher survived her patrol and returned to hunt again because she was designed to survive, crewed to survive, supported to survive. Because survival was engineered into every rivet and valve and procedure. Because abundance allowed for redundancy, and redundancy transformed occasional fortune into consistent outcome. In the end, the submarine and her crew were not heroes defying impossible odds. They were the impossible odds, delivered wholesale against an enemy who had bet everything on the superiority of will over material, and discovered, depth charge by depth charge, sinking ship by sinking ship, that the bet was already lost before the first torpedo left its tube.